Future of Work report has revealed risks and recommendations to employers for healthy discourse through changing job patterns. The report by global law firm Herbert Smith Freehills has found that meaningful engagement with employees should be a top priority. It also highlights that company culture should be considered before policy is implemented, and the report further indicates that economic headwinds have dampened activism. For more on this, we are joined by employment lawyer Jacqui to discuss this report further. Thank you so much for your time, Jacqui. Trends that have emerged, which are they that have been picked up by this report?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Yes, so what we found in our most recent Future of Work report is that economic headwinds and the cost of living crisis has meant that employee activism has been dampened recently. It appears as if employees are concerned about their security within the employment of their employers, and so they are less likely to be active in the workplace and make demands. However, we believe that this is short-lived and that in time to come, the cost of living crisis will actually be the trigger for activism, whether it be micro-activism, which is activism on a smaller scale within committees within the workplace, or macro-activism, as we've seen throughout our history in employment law in South Africa, which is strike action.
It's an interesting finding there, and I'd like us to unpack and unbunk what the core meaning of activism would be within the employment landscape.
So activism is things that employees require from their employers. So, for example, you have circumstances now where we've just recently introduced the Companies Amendment Bill, which deals with and attempts to make pay transparency more apparent, so that we're aware of what people in senior positions are paid versus people in lower positions. This is quite a similar approach to the approach that's been taken in the EU and Australia with their respective legislation. So the reason why that legislation was put in place is because there appeared to be activism around and concerns around transparency in relation to pay. Of course, we are aware of what very senior employees in public companies paid, but of course, in the private companies, there obviously isn't the same level of requirement, and so there was this introduction of this legislation in order to try and address that, because what that will hopefully do is it will hopefully reduce activism. Of course, in South Africa, we have a history of strike action where there are negotiations that don't render results that the employees want in terms of pay increases, bonuses, allowances, and things like that. So that is macro activism that you see. Unfortunately, what we often have in South Africa, and I think this is probably also sparked by the cost of living crisis, and we've seen this get more and more aggressive and violent, unfortunately, in strike action. But traditionally, what one would hope is that strike action is there in order to persuade the employer to change their position in relation to the negotiations. So, but in the workplace, in a workplace where strike action does not feature for whatever reason, either it's because those types of employees aren't represented by unions, or the nature of the workplace is such that strikes do not occur. So, for example, in possibly an office environment, for example, you would have then committees. So you have various committees. You have the Diversity and Inclusion Committee or the Remuneration Committee. And what we see is we see activism occurring within those committees, and committees making recommendations that are to go to the management or the exco about what employees want and need. And that's a form of micro-activism. And what we're seeing is that dampen at the moment, because employees are essentially concerned that if they raise issues, employers will find other reasons to dismiss them because of the difficulties, of course, that everyone is facing economically globally. But we believe that will eventually turn itself around and, in fact, will be the trigger for activism going forward.
Lastly, Jacqui, I must ask you about weather safety features in this report, given the emergence of news that there's been 11 people killed at an impala mine in Rustenburg in a cage fall. And this is an industry in South Africa that fuels the economy, is a large employee absorber. But at the same time, the risks of fatalities is a feature within this particular sector of the South African labor landscape. How much is safety a concern for most employees, especially when it comes to how this matter is dealt with by management and the employer themselves and mitigation processes there?
Yes, I was very sorry to hear that news. My condolences to those involved. Yes, of course, health and safety is absolutely critical. Of course, we have the Occupational Health and Safety Act and we have the Mine Health and Safety Act. And both of those pieces of legislation create an obligation on employers to ensure that employees have a safe and healthy working environment. Obviously, within the mining space, this is a critical aspect of an employee's work life. And you can't have a situation, of course, where employees are concerned about their safety. So certainly safety is absolutely critical, and it is very important, obviously, for employers to ensure that they comply with all their health and safety obligations. There is also an obligation, importantly, on employees to ensure that they ensure that other employees are also safe and occupy space that will not result in them being hurt in any way. So certainly that issue is of major importance within those specific sectors. Of course, it's less so, of course, in your office environments, although you obviously do have accidents there, but certainly more prevalent in this case. So I think what's very important is for employers in the health and safety space to ensure that regular training is done in order to ensure that employees are aware of the rules in relation to safety, what the consequences could be in the event that the rules are not followed. I recall many years ago when I was doing health and safety work with a client, one of my colleagues said to me, what happens often in these circumstances where there are accidents is someone is just doing something quickly to kind of make sure it happens. And unfortunately, that's often when accidents happen. And so it's very, very important for employers to ensure that their employees know the ramifications and consequences of not complying with health and safety regulations and ensure that their employees are properly trained in order to ensure that these incidents and accidents are kept to the absolute minimum.
Thank you so much for your input, Jacqui Reid, an employment lawyer there, speaking to us about the report that looks into the future of work.